Developments in the war against Iran, with word now just into us that the U.S. military has hit 2 locations in Iran near the Strait of Hormuz.
Iran's Revolutionary Guard announcing the critical waterway is once again shut. That comes less than 24 hours after Iran's foreign minister said it was completely open, a move that President...
The strait was already closing before Washington issued the first formal warning. Not in the legal sense. Not in the sense that ships had stopped moving. But in the way that a room goes quiet before an argument, when everyone can feel what's about to happen, but no one has said it yet. Oil tanker captains were rerouting. Insurance premiums were doubling overnight. 3 Panamax-class vessels had quietly reversed course somewhere south of Fujairah without explanation. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, was beginning to feel smaller by the hour. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy had been building toward this moment for years. Not with dramatic proclamations, though there were plenty of those, but with infrastructure, with patience, with an understanding that you do not beat the United States Navy in a fair fight, you change the definition of what a fair fight looks like. Their doctrine, refined through decades of asymmetric study, was built around a single premise: if the cost of transit becomes high enough, the strait closes itself. You do not need to win. You only need to make winning look too expensive. By early spring, the IRGC had repositioned 3 squadrons of fast attack craft to forward staging bases on Qeshm Island and the Abu Musa archipelago. These were not the aging speedboats of the 1980s tanker wars. They were Saraj-class and Zulfikar-class vessels, built low to the water, radar-reflective hulls, capable of sustaining 50 knots in calm seas. Each one carried a mix of C-704 anti-ship missiles, unguided rockets, and in some configurations, explosives packed into the bow for terminal ramming attacks. They were designed to overwhelm, not outfight. To flood a threat picture until something got through. The mines had gone in weeks earlier. That was the part that didn't make the news immediately. The Mujh-class frigate Iris Sahand had conducted what Iranian state media described as routine navigation exercises in the Central Channel. Satellite imagery later analyzed by the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency showed something else: a pattern of small splashes off the vessel's stern, too regular to be wake turbulence, occurring at intervals consistent with bottom mooring mine deployment. The IRGC hadn't announced a minefield. They didn't need to. Rumors were enough. Tanker captains don't wait for confirmation before they start asking questions. The decision in Washington came after a 48-hour window of deliberate silence that fooled almost no one. The Fifth Fleet had been at increased readiness posture since the previous week. 2 carrier strike groups, one centered on USS Gerald R. Ford already in the northern Arabian Sea, one on USS Theodore Roosevelt operating out of Diego Garcia, were repositioned without public announcement, their movements obscured by a combination of emissions control and deliberate AIS spoofing. A third surface action group, built around 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, had been quietly staged near the strait entrance for 11 days. The force wasn't assembled in response to the crisis. It was assembled in anticipation of it. At 2:41 in the morning local time, the USS Bulkeley, Flight IIA Arleigh Burke, hull number DDG-84, 7 years deep into a service life that had seen it cycle through the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and 3 previous deployments to Fifth Fleet, received an encrypted fire control order from the Fleet Operations Center in Bahrain. The message was 14 words long. The captain read it twice. Then he handed it back to his communications officer and told him to acknowledge receipt. The order was not an authorization to open fire. It was something more unsettling than that. It was permission to prepare for a scenario the crew had wargamed dozens of times, and which until 48 hours ago had still felt theoretical. The IRGC was going to move. The only question was when, and in what configuration. The Bulkeley's Combat Information Center ran through its standard pre-engagement checklist with a kind of disciplined efficiency that comes not from adrenaline but from repetition. Aegis Combat System status verified. Spy-6 radar in active track mode. Mark 41 vertical launch system cells confirmed loaded. A mix of SM-2 and SM-6 interceptors in the forward cells. Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles in the aft launcher. 2 Tomahawk cruise missiles in dedicated positions that no one was thinking about yet, but everyone knew were there. The SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite cycled through its self-diagnostic routines. The Phalanx CWS mounts, fore and aft, completed their slew and track tests. The 5-inch Mark 45 gun crew ran a bore verification and went to standby. The ship was ready in the mechanical sense. Readiness in the psychological sense is harder to verify, and the captain didn't try. His crew was experienced. That would have to be enough. Above the strait, 2 assets were already in position before anyone on the surface fired a shot. AP-8A Poseidon from Patrol Squadron 16 had been on station for 3 hours, operating at 29,000 feet with its APY-10 multi-mode radar in wide-area maritime search configuration. The P-8 is many things. In the public imagination, it is an anti-submarine aircraft, and it does that job exceptionally well. But in a congested littoral environment, what it really is a nervous system. It ingests radar returns, acoustic data from sonobuoys, signals intelligence feeds, and real-time satellite imagery overlays, and it fuses that information into a common operational picture that the entire fleet can see simultaneously. On the night in question, the crew had been watching the Keshem Island staging areas for 2 hours before anything moved. They saw the IRGC formation begin organizing well before the first boat cleared the harbor entrance. The second asset was a pair of F/18 E Super Hornets from VFA 87, orbiting 30 miles south of the strait at 22,000 feet, already armed and already checked in on the fleet's tactical frequency. They were not the primary strike asset for what was about to happen. They were insurance. And if the scenario developed in ways that required insurance, someone was going to have a very complicated morning. At 3:09 a.m., the P-8 crew transmitted a formation update to the fleet. 47 fast attack craft had cleared the harbor complex at Keshem and were moving northwest in 3 loose echelons. Speed over ground, 38 knots. Bearing, toward the central channel. Time to engagement envelope, approximately 22 minutes at current rate. A fourth group of roughly 15 vessels was moving east from the Abu Musa anchorage, apparently attempting to cut off the southern approach. The captain of the Bulkeley noted that the formation was larger than the most recent threat assessment had predicted. He said so to his executive officer. His executive officer agreed. Neither of them changed what they were going to do about it. What happened next followed a logic that is difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't spent time inside a fleet engagement, because it did not resemble the chaotic, seconds-long crisis that the phrase swarm attack implies. It was methodical. Brutally, deliberately methodical. The IRGC had designed their approach to create confusion, multiple threat vectors, electronic interference from shore-based jammers that began cycling up within minutes of the formation's departure, and a wave of Shahid 136 loitering munitions launched from a coastal site on the island's southern tip, presumably to force the Aegis system into tracking mode against aerial threats while the surface formation closed the distance. The Aegis handled it the way Aegis handles most things, which is to say it didn't panic, because it is not capable of panic. The SBY-6 radar, upgraded from the older Spy 1D series, processed approximately 60,000 radar returns per second. The loitering munitions, there were 11 of them, were tracked, classified, and handed off to the SM-2 engagement queue within 4 seconds of detection. The first 2 interceptors left the forward VLS at 3:19 a.m. They did not miss. The IRGC's shore-based electronic warfare package was more interesting. The jamming system, assessed by signals intelligence analysts as a derivative of Russian Krasuka technology with locally modified waveforms, succeeded in degrading the Bulkeley's data link quality by roughly 30% for approximately 8 minutes. This is the kind of number that sounds significant in a briefing and is less significant in practice, because degraded does not mean broken, and the P-8 overhead was operating on a separate frequency architecture that the jamming package was not optimized to target. The common operational picture stayed up. Rough around the edges, but up. The MH-60R Seahawk from the Bulkeley's flight deck had been airborne since 2:55 a.m. It was operating in a boundary role, far enough forward to provide targeting data, close enough to the ship to remain under the Aegis umbrella if things went badly wrong. The crew had been monitoring the underwater environment with active dipping sonar and a line of sonobuoys dropped in a barrier pattern across the central channel. At 3:24 a.m., they got something. The acoustic return was subtle. The analysis software flagged it as low confidence initially, a magnetic anomaly signature consistent with a moored mine casing, overlapping with the expected noise floor from surface vessel traffic. The sensor operator on the Seahawk ran the data through a second filter and upgraded the confidence to moderate. He reported it to the Combat Information Center using the specific brevity code that means, "There may be mines here, we are not certain, do not proceed until we are." The captain ordered the Surface Action Group to hold position 2 miles east of the reported coordinates and wait for confirmation. This decision, not a dramatic one, not a cinematic one, just a captain being careful, probably saved the ship. Because there were mines there. The subsequent sweep confirmed it. 11 Mudge pattern bottom mines, anchored at depths between 12 and 18 meters, arranged in a pattern that would have been directly in the Bulkeley's path if she had pushed west to close with a fast attack formation at maximum speed. The IRGC had not placed the mines randomly. They had placed them where an aggressive American commander, focused on the surface threat, might drive directly into them while trying to shorten the engagement range. The trap was well designed. It just required the Americans to be in a hurry, and they weren't. At 3:31 a.m., with a fast attack formation now inside 15 miles and accelerating, the Bulkeley began its defensive engagement sequence. The Mark 45 gun opened at a range of 12 miles, firing extended-range munitions in airburst mode, the rounds detonating at programmed altitudes above the water surface to scatter fragmentation across wide areas. At this range, the rounds were not expected to destroy targets reliably. They were expected to disrupt the formation, force evasive maneuvers, degrade speed by time. They did all three. 6 IRGC vessels peeled off from the lead echelon in the first 90 seconds of fire, either hit or convinced they were about to be. The remaining formation pressed forward. This was expected. The IRGC had trained their personnel to accept losses and maintain advance. Western analysts had documented this doctrine for years. The question was always how many you could attrit before they reached terminal engagement range. The answer in this case was most of them. At 3:38 a.m., the 2 Super Hornets from VFA 87 were authorized to engage. They descended from 22,000 feet and rolled in from the southwest, each aircraft carrying AGM-65F Maverick missiles optimized for maritime surface targets and a pair of GBU-38 JDM bombs for secondary use against anything that had stopped moving. The P-8 overhead provided continuous targeting updates, the data flowing directly into the Super Hornet targeting pods with sufficient precision that the pilots could designate individual vessels rather than working by area. The Mavericks did what Mavericks do. The infrared seeker in the F variant was designed specifically for the temperature signature of marine engines. Hot exhaust plumes against cold water, a contrast that makes targeting in a dark strait at 3 in the morning almost straightforward. The pilots worked through their ordnance systematically. Not quickly by movie standards, but quickly by real standards. 12 Mavericks in 7 minutes. The formation's eastern element, the 15 vessels from Abu Musa, had been hanging back, apparently waiting for the northern assault to draw the Bulkeley's attention before committing. At 3:44 a.m., they accelerated toward the southern approach at maximum speed. The Seahawk crew spotted the movement immediately and relayed coordinates. The second Super Hornet broke off from the northern engagement and came around to the south, arriving overhead with 3 Mavericks remaining and a full load of 20mm cannon rounds. The pilot later described the engagement in terms that were notably understated for the circumstances. The boats were not maneuvering effectively, he said. They were bunched together and running in a straight line. He fired twice. Then he used the gun. The southern element ceased to be a coherent force at approximately 3:52 a.m. What remained, scattered vessels, some damaged, some intact, all without formation cohesion, presented a different kind of problem. Boats in the water, not all of them moving, some appearing to carry wounded crew, in proximity to a minefield that had not yet been fully cleared at night, with the Bulkeley still holding position east of the mine barrier. The rules of engagement do not become simpler when the shooting slows down. They often become more complicated. The captain instructed his crew to track all remaining surface contacts and hold fire against any vessel not actively maneuvering toward the ship or displaying weapons in a ready configuration. This is the kind of order that is easy to give and extremely difficult to execute at 3:50 in the morning after 30 minutes of combat, when every radar blip carries the potential of being the one that didn't get the message. At 4:06 a.m., a single fast attack craft, later identified as a tier-class vessel, a smaller design than the Serge, came around the eastern edge of the minefield at high speed, bearing directly for the Bulkeley on a collision course. No radio transmission. No deviation from course. The Phalanx CWS tracked it for 11 seconds, engaged autonomously at 900 meters, and destroyed it approximately 400 meters from the ship's port bow. The system fired for less than 2 seconds. No one gave an order. That is what the system is designed for. After that, nothing else moved toward the ship. The mine clearance operation began at 4:20 a.m. and ran through the early morning hours. A pair of MH-53EC Dragon helicopters, tasked specifically for mine countermeasures, were vectored in from the USS Bataan, which had been staged well south of the engagement zone. They worked methodically through the central channel with towed acoustic sweeping gear, detonating 5 mines in controlled fashion and marking the remaining 6 for follow-on disposal by Navy explosive ordnance disposal divers. The channel was declared conditionally clear for deep draft traffic at 7:40 a.m. The first commercial vessel to transit following the engagement was a Suezmax tanker carrying Iraqi crude, outbound from the Basra oil terminal. She passed through the central channel at reduced speed, her master presumably aware that the water around her had been a war zone 5 hours earlier, and arrived at her next waypoint without incident. The oil continued moving. The IRGC issued no immediate statement. Iranian state media ran a brief report attributing damage to IRGC vessels to a treacherous and unprovoked American attack on defensive forces conducting legitimate exercises. The framing was aggressive, but the language was notably absent of the usual calls for retaliation. Tehran had done the calculation, and the calculation did not produce a result that recommended a second attempt. What the IRGC had bet everything on was the idea that mass would compensate for quality, that 47 fast attack craft moving in coordinated echelons, supported by mines and jamming and drone decoys, would overwhelm a single destroyer's ability to process threats fast enough to survive. It was not an irrational bet. Against an older system, against a crew with less rehearsal time, against a force without persistent overhead surveillance and real-time targeting fusion, some version of that bet might have paid off. The doctrine had logic behind it. But the engagement it produced was not a close call. It was not a narrow escape. It was a targeting exercise. The Aegis system never got close to saturation. The P-8 crew never lost the picture. The pilots never ran out of weapons before they ran out of targets. And the captain, by being careful about a mine report that his software flagged as moderate confidence rather than high, avoided the one scenario that could have changed the outcome of the entire night. The strait did not close. It never really came close to closing. What closed instead was the IRGC's operational reserve, most of its forward-deployed fast attack capability, 2 of its coastal radar stations taken out by Tomahawk strikes authorized at 4:15 a.m. as a separate action, and whatever remained of the argument that asymmetric swarming could deny the United States access to the Central Channel under realistic combat conditions. That argument had been tested before, in exercises, in war games, in theoretical papers written by serious strategists. It had produced compelling results in those settings. In the Strait of Hormuz on a dark spring morning, against a force that had positioned itself correctly and waited with patience for the IRGC to make the first move, it produced a different result entirely. The tankers kept moving. The price of oil spiked for 48 hours and then came back down. The Fifth Fleet issued a terse operational report that confirmed the engagement without providing casualty figures. The captain of the Bulkeley filed his after-action report and went to sleep for 6 hours. None of this resolved the underlying problem. The IRGC still existed. The mines that hadn't detonated were still on the seabed until EOD finished its work. The shore facilities on Keshem and Abu Musa would be rebuilt, eventually, or replaced by something that had learned from what went wrong. The geopolitical conditions that had produced Operation Hormuz Gatekeeper, whatever the IRGC had actually called it internally, hadn't changed because 47 fast attack boats were now sitting on the bottom of the strait. But the strait was open. And for the moment, that was what it needed to be.